Hey everybody, this is Mr. Marshall with another U.S. History Review. This one's on civil rights. And we're going to be taking a look at the rights of a couple of different groups. African Americans, women, Latin Americans, Native Americans, all this good stuff. And as usual, just like the other reviews, whenever you see the dancing pencil, it's talking about the essays, something that focuses on the essays. And whenever you see this dancing star, it's something that focuses on the multiple choice. So the first thing to take a look at is these key amendments. These are known as the Reconstruction Amendments because they come out right after the Civil War. And it's the only ones that you actually need to know the number for. You have the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, which made everyone citizens. All you have to do is be born here and you're a citizen. Doesn't matter what color you just happen to be. And then the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote. But it still didn't give the right to vote to women. They're not going to get that till 1920. So you can vote, doesn't matter what color you are, but you got to be a guy. Unfortunately, a lot of people were trying to keep African Americans from voting and keep them from getting a lot of the rights that these amendments gave them. And that was from the black codes, that was with the Jim Crow laws that allowed for segregation, and then you have Plessy versus Ferguson, you get the little verse, so it's a Supreme Court case, which upheld segregation. That's where we get the phrase separate but equal is perfectly fine. And the Regents loves this court case because it gets overturned later, and it shows like the changing times, how people's viewpoints and how laws can change. And then the last thing right here is the literacy tests, the poll taxes, and the grandfather clause, which were different methods that were used to try to prevent people from voting, as well as the KKK sitting out in front of the polling places with, clubs in their hands. That also did it. So you had a literacy test, which they'd have you read something like ridiculous in order to be able to vote. The poll tax, which they would charge you money to be able to vote. And the grandfather clause, where you'd only vote if your grandfather could vote. Right? Different methods that were used. Right? And eventually, when African Americans start participating in World War II, it has a big impact in the way that people viewed them. African Americans had always fought in our wars. Revolutionary War, Civil War, all these different ones. But once we get into World War II, military units start to become desegregated. Because in World War II, we had like completely black military units. You'd have your white units and your black units, squads, platoons, anything like that. And then once the military is desegregated, the white soldiers and black soldiers are fighting alongside each other in the same unit. Right? And it did a lot to start to change people's minds, start to change the way that people viewed things. Right? And a little after that, you start to get the civil rights movement. Right? This is where you start to get Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, all these big names. Right? And the most important part, well, not the most important part, but one of them is Brown versus Board of Ed. This is what ended the segregation in schools. This was a huge thing at the time. You have Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. Right? And of course, the civil disobedience that Martin Luther King preached. To protest as much as you possibly can, but to do it in a non-violent way. To do sit-ins like these guys are doing right here, where you go to a diner, you go to a restaurant, and you just sit there. You don't order any food, you don't give them any business, but it's a method of protesting. And when the cops come to arrest you, you don't resist, you just go completely limp, like dead weight. That way it's even that much more difficult for the cops to get you out of there, and the cops look that much worse. On the left right here, you have the freedom rides. People would get on these buses and drive around in the South, as a form of protest. And then right here you have another form of protest, which is being broken up by the police. Now, eventually this stuff is going to lead to not only Brown versus Board of Ed, which ended segregation, but these different civil rights laws. The Equal Rights Act, which guaranteed everybody equal rights, ended segregation in other places. You have the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination in voting practices. It got rid of the literacy tests, got rid of the grandfather clause, or at least it was supposed to end everything. It takes time for people's viewpoints, for the culture to change. And they actually ended up needing to come out with the 24th Amendment to then end the poll tax, because the Voting Rights Act wasn't enough. Right? A little later on down the road, they tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, which was it was intended to be like a little bit stronger of a law, a little bit stronger legislation to try to get equal rights for everyone, but it didn't pass in enough states because a lot of people considered it to be repetitive. You know, they were like, we already have the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Why do we need this? So it didn't actually go through all the way. In terms of the women's rights movement, this is a real quick timeline. So you have the Seneca Falls Convention, where you have Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you know, some of these really famous women who are get together and tried to lead, you know, the early women's rights movement, you know, saying that they should be able to get into the workforce, trying to change people's opinions. Okay? And eventually, the 19th Amendment does come out. You know, women do get the right to vote in 1920. And then people's opinions on women working and women leaving the home really change in the 1940s because they have to go into the workforce for World War II. You know, we needed shells, we needed ammunition, all these different things. You know, and then after that, you have Roe versus Wade, which we hear about Roe versus Wade all the time, even today, which is what made abortions legal. You know, that's another thing that comes up in just about every presidential debate. Some of the other groups, Latino Americans, you have Cesar Chavez. You know, there's a lot of work being done right now to try to get more legislation to make it so that they can get their rights, to make it so that they can get, you know, minimum wage, that they can get scholarships to go to college and different things like that. You have Native Americans who we've treated horribly throughout our entire history. You know, with the Trail of Tears, with forcing them onto different reservations, and then you start to have AIM, AIM, the American Indian Movement, and the violence that happened in Alcatraz. And also the disabled Americans. You have the Disabled Americans Act of 1990, which prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities. You know, you have to start having ramps to get into buildings, to have handicapped entrances, you know, to make sure that public buildings have elevators, things like that. You know, that happens because of this legislation that's passed. These are a couple setbacks to the civil rights movement, where you have affirmative action, which is not necessarily a setback, but some people viewed it that way because some people got annoyed that the preference was being given to these minority groups, because when it first came out, it was you had to have certain quotas. And a lot of people had problems with that, so now they've changed it. Now, instead of having it where you have to have a certain number of people in each minority, you get additional points onto your applications, depending on what your ethnicity is. And depending on the changing times, depending on how many people are going to college or how many people are going into different fields, the number of points that you get changes. So they've kind of altered affirmative action to fit what people want it to be, you know, while still helping out the people that need it. And then you have the women's rights down here, which is some people say that, you know, it's led to a loss of traditional values, you know, an increased divorce rate in latchkey children. A latchkey child is somebody who, when they get home, there's no parents because both people are working, so they have to fix themselves their own snack and start on their own homework and things. So you know, how much women's rights and how much these equal rights movements have affected these two things is kind of up to you, but these are a few of the things that people think are problems with everything that's going on. And that's it for this review, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure that you're studying for the Regents. It's coming.